The New Orleans Saints should absolutely be willing to consider Hendon Hooker in this year's NFL draft, even though it might mean a regime change in order to make it work. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today Saints Wire, Tuesdays in Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday, and then some on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, who across the network sponsor Crossover Thursday as well. Prize Picks is so much fun that I know that you're going to love it as well. It's daily fantasy made the way that it should be. You simply pick 2 to 5 players, choose whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their Prize Picks projection. Get those right, and you can win up to 10 times your entry just for only taking about 60 seconds or so to put that entry down in the first place. And if you're a first-time user, you get a 100% into deposit match of up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, it is our second episode of the day. If you missed the earlier episode, breaking down Desmond Ridder, Desmond Ridder, who will be the starting quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons next week, looking at Chris Olave, Rashid, Shaheed, a couple other things for you over in the morning session. But the evening session, as always, as we move forward here throughout the rest of the regular season, is about the future. So for today, we're looking at Hendon Hooker and why the New Orleans Saints absolutely should be interested in the young quarterback from Tennessee despite the injury. Today, we're going to break down his draft stock, how it was impacted by that injury, if the Saints can even get him. Remember, they don't have a first-round pick as of right now, and the regime change that may have to precede a selection for Hendon Hooker and why that might be the case. How do you make a system for this young quarterback? We'll break down Tennessee's system and how it might translate to the NFL and how you can make it happen. So to get us started here, we're going to start off with a look at the draft stock. Of course, the Saints should be interested without hesitation despite Hendon Hooker's injury. If you don't know, Hendon Hooker suffered an ACL tear just a few weeks ago during one of his games with Tennessee. And because of that, a lot of people have been sort of concerned about whether or not he's going to be ready to start the NFL season. But there are a couple of things that if you're a Hendon Hooker fan or if you like his fit with the New Orleans Saints, that maybe put you at a little bit of ease. There's 2 prime examples that fit the timeline here for a Hendon Hooker. One of them has a bit of a caveat, so we'll start there. Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson, during his rookie season with the Houston Texans, had an ACL tear in October. It was October 29th, and he was ready to come back before his second season began to start all 16 games. So that means that October 29th is when the injury happened. He was ready to go by September 9th the following year. The caveat, he was 22 years old. 22 years old, 2 years younger than Hendon Hooker was when he had his ACL injury just a few weeks ago. But there's another look here that actually is right on line almost to the day in terms of whether or not, or to give you an example about whether or not Hendon Hooker could be back in time for a rookie season if drafted this year or when drafted this year. And that's Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow had not only an ACL tear, but he also had MCL damage, had a whole MCL injury as well during his rookie year with the Cincinnati Bengals. Came back to play every single game his second year, including playoffs. And of course, the Super Bowl appearance, his ACL tear was on November 22nd, was back ready to go at September 12th. His ACL tear took place when he was 24 years old, made the return to the field his second season at 25 years old. Hendon Hooker's injury was November 19th, just 3 days earlier in terms of the calendar date, than Joe Burrow's at 24 years old. Could he be ready by the beginning of or the middle of September at 25 years old? Joe Burrow, as an example, says yes. Now we know that every single injury is different. You can look at Jamison Williams, who had his in January of this year. basically was activated like 5 days ago. Although he's been working back, he's been doing all these things. It's a little bit of a different ask if you're a wide receiver, a small statured wide receiver like Jameson Williams is, playing on, that ACL injury, all of that, a little bit different than what you're asked to do as a quarterback, all of those things. The other thing to consider, Deshaun Watson, as well as Joe Burrow, both had NFL training facilities from day one to day none when it came to recovering from their injury. Hendon Hooker won't have NFL training facilities and an NFL treatment plan until he is drafted by an NFL team. So that is something to keep in mind. The other thing to consider in terms of his draft stock is his age. I mentioned his age before, 24 years old when he had that injury. Once he's drafted, he'll be 25 years old as of January. And with that, it would make him actually the third oldest quarterback ever selected in the NFL draft. So is that something that also impacts his draft stock? And I think for a lot of people, it's a narrative. And for a lot of people, they'll say that it does. But as we see quarterbacks play later and later and later into their careers, I think that the idea of a 24, 25-year-old quarterback doesn't really scare NFL teams the way that it scares the general public. It's not really the same thing anymore. It's not the same game. Quarterbacks are a lot more protected. And honestly, you look at what it was that he did during his time at Tennessee, he only got better. And I think there are a lot of people who will also ding Hendon Hooker by saying that he was only good for one season. And I have a really hard time agreeing with that. If you look back at his first senior season, before his redshirt senior season, back in 2021, he averaged 9.7 yards per play. In his final year, he averaged 9.5. In his second to last year, he averaged 11.3 adjusted yards per play. In his final year, he averaged 10.9. He had 31 to 3 touchdown to interception ratio in 2021, 27 to 2 touchdown interception ratio in 2022. 101.4 passer rating in 2021, 175.5 passer rating in 2022. By all intents and purposes, his 2021 season might have actually been better than his 2022 season. He just threw more passes in 2022 for more yards because he completed more of those passes. But on a yards per average or yards per attempt average, breaking it down on a per throw basis, he averaged more slightly in 2021. So it's effectively the same season 2 years in a row. To me, that shows you longevity. To me, that shows you that not only did this super simplified system that he had in Tennessee this year help him out, you saw the success in that same system the year before. So this idea that he's a one and done guy, I think is being a little bit overblown. And again, it's a common narrative for young quarterbacks to look at age and try to overinflate it, as well as look at one season of production and try to overinflate it. I think Joe Burrow is a pretty good example of that, although correlation, causation, all of those conversations. So is he a first or a second round candidate based on all of this evidence? And the answer is yes. It kind of depends on where whoever is quarterback needy is drafting and how quickly the top three guys go off the board. Guys like Bryce Young, guys like CJ Stroud, and you imagine Will Levis is going to be up there as well. I'm not the biggest Will Levis stan myself, but I do really like the idea of Hendon Hooker to the New Orleans Saints and think that they should absolutely roll the dice on him, especially if they don't get a first round pick in the Sean Payton trade, which we would expect to happen this offseason. We'll see. And do select him in the second round, it's worth that risk. But getting that first round selection and getting that fifth year option on a quarterback is always of value as well. So we'll see which route the New Orleans Saints go. If they do feel like he's absolutely their guy, moving up into the first round does make sense. But how do you get that done? There's actually a couple ways that the Saints can do it. We're going to break that down next. Yes, the Saints should draft Hendon Hooker or consider drafting Hendon Hooker. How do they make it happen? That's what we're discussing as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible has a slate of new NFL podcasts for you to enjoy, and I know you're going to love them. That's why we're actually giving you a sneak peek of one of them. It's the Block Forever podcast. You can find it available on the Locked On NFL podcast right now. Block Forever is a brand new podcast featuring former NFL All-Pro Ryan Kalil and presented by Audible. Kalil brings the conversation around the NFL to the next level. He gives all of you football fans an insider's look through the eyes of the greatest players and personalities of all time. Speaking to guys like Christian McCaffrey, who talks about kind of his love-hate relationship with fantasy football. Even talks to wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster, who gives his most honest opinions around other players and positions across the league, because no topic is out of bounds when it comes to the Block Forever podcast. Available free on Audible or wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you head over to Locked On NFL today to get that free sneak peek, or you catch the full series wherever you get your podcasts, available everywhere. Now, Audible, get in the game. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Yeah, the Saints should be interested in Hendon Hooker, but how do they make it happen? If they want to get up to the first round, how do they do that? Or if they want to stand pat in the second round, could he make it there? That's what we're breaking down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of our future series now into our draft breakdowns, which we'll do every Thursday. Okay. I appreciate you as always making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to also go and check out Locked On Sports today as well. The podcast bringing you everything you need to know around the world of sports, taking you beyond the scoreboard, behind the scenes with the Locked On local experts, giving you the insight that only Locked On can provide. Find it wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube as well. All right, so let's take a look at Hendon Hooker here. Like we mentioned, he's somebody that should be a Heisman candidate. He was kind of the Heisman frontrunner in conversation before that ACL injury. We broke down what the injury means. We broke down sort of what the age and his level of production means. We're going to get to his system and scheme next. But right now, how did the New Orleans Saints even get in position for a quarterback in 2023 and in that draft? There are a couple of different ways they might be able to do this. Let's start off with the easy one, which is them sort of standing pat in the second round. If they stand pat in the second round, what that does basically is that it gives you an opportunity to grab kind of the best quarterback available in that round. But you can understand why the New Orleans Saints might itch to move up into the first round to draft a quarterback, especially based on the fact that a first round investment brings in what's called a fifth year option. If you don't know what a fifth year option means, it basically just allows you to be able to activate a fifth year of the rookie contract at a scaled percentage based upon where they're drafted, and keeps that player locked in for that fifth year. You saw them use that fifth year option when it came to Marcus Davenport, several other first round picks as well. If they think that he's the guy, right, if they really, really like him, which is possible, let's not forget that Andy Dalton was not the first option in New Orleans, that Jameis Winston wasn't the first option in New Orleans, that Deshaun Watson was the first option in New Orleans. And as much as I was uncomfortable with that pursuit, especially while all of those cases were open and all that stuff, that's really the kind of mold that Dennis Allen wanted. That's the mold that the New Orleans Saints wanted at quarterback, was a pocket passer with a big arm that had the mobility to get outside of the pocket and extend plays and be able to make plays with his legs without having to rely or live or die by the legs. That's kind of who Hendon Hooker is. He's very comfortable in the pocket. He's a good passer, not just deep. He also completed 83.4% of his passes between 0 to 9 yards, and sort of in that short area of the field, and threw 47.4% of his passes in 2022 there. Those just aren't the passes that make the highlight reels, right? Just around 20% of his passes went downfield, of which he completed around 43%, which is a very good percentage. Doesn't sound like it, but when you're talking about 20 yards downfield, 43% is a really, really good percentage. So he was one of the better deep ball passers in college football. Yes, but there's more to his game than that. Kind of feels like the Chris Olave of quarterbacks in a way, right? Remember, everybody talked about Chris Olave being a field stretcher, a deep threat, deep speed. Everything was yards before a catch, blah, blah, blah. And then we see what he has turned into and continued to be for the New Orleans Saints in the short and intermediate area as well. So if the Saints decide that he's the guy and they want that fifth year option, here's how they get it done. If you draft that quarterback in the first round, despite the fact that he has those injury concerns, the fifth year option with the injury concerns might even be better for you, right? Is he going to be available your first year? Is he not? You get the fifth year option to where you can move on from him after 3 years of play if you don't like it, or you have sort of the fourth year that you can activate if he misses his rookie season, which we'll see. That doesn't feel too terribly likely because ACL injuries aren't what they used to be now in the NFL. So if you want to get into the first round, there's two ways that the Saints can do it. They could trade up into the bottom of the first round, regardless of what happens with Sean Payton, right? Because you imagine right now the Saints are projected as being around the between 36 to, I'll say between 33 to 37, right? 38. That's kind of where they're projecting to pick in the second round. So pretty tight to the first round. Wouldn't take a lot to move from there into the first round. You think about the Baltimore Ravens years ago who moved from, early second round into pick 32, the last pick of the first round, and then they grabbed Lamar Jackson with that selection so that they would get that fifth year option. You could do that same thing. Similarly, if you're not comfortable sitting back at 36, 34, whatever, if you're not comfortable just sitting there and waiting around, then in that case, you could move up that little bit, those couple of picks, maybe cost you a fifth or a sixth, maybe a fourth at most, be able to move up there a couple of spots and then grab a quarterback on that fifth year option. Or You roll the dice, you stand pat at 36, 34, 35, whatever, and you see what falls to you. And if he's there, then you scoop him up. So there's an option for you there. The other way that you could potentially move into the first round is, of course, Sean Payton. If Sean Payton decides that he wants to get back to coaching in 2023, then you could trade his rights to the team that, he decides that he wants to go to. Remember, he has some say in that, a lot of say in that. And then if you get a first round pick back in return for that, then all of a sudden you have a first round pick. You can make a pick at quarterback if you want to. Or if you make the trade and you get, let's say, a second round pick this year, a second round pick next year, and a first round pick next year, you could move next. You would have 2 first round picks for 2024. You could move one of those to get up into the first round here in 2023, or you just inherently get a first round pick from that trade. The other way the Saints could go is if they get a first round pick in that trade, they could use that first round pick for another, important position. They could go edge rusher. They could go offensive line. They could go safety. They could do pretty much anything that they wanted with that first round selection, another wide receiver, whatever it is they decide to do. And then in the second round, see if Hendon Hooker is there and scoop him up, or still trade up to get, back into the bottom of the first round. So there's a couple of different ways that the Saints would be able to get this done. It is not out of the question whether Hendon Hooker is somebody whose draft stock raises back up and he becomes a first round pick, or if he stays kind of in this second round pick area in terms of his, age, his, and his injury. Those are going to be the two big things. And the Saints are not out of position to get him in that case either. In fact, they might even be in better position to get him in that latter case. So it's not out of the question at all for how the New Orleans Saints could get him. It's not out of the question at all whether or not the New Orleans Saints should be interested in him, especially with not really having a quarterback on contract next year. Andy Dalton's not under contract next year. Jake Lutton's not the guy. Is Jameis Winston going to stick around based upon how everything went this year? Who knows, right? And then there's an out in his contract after this year. So the Saints could be looking at solving a quarterback problem because that quarterback room might be barren by the time that they get to the NFL draft. We'll see how it all goes. The next piece is, what do you do with him? Because if you're going to draft Hendon Hooker, will this offensive staff be equipped to take advantage of his skill set? That might not be the case, but they might not be as far off as you'd think. I'll tell you what changes they would need to make and which ones they could make on top of those in order to make things work with Hendon Hooker. And we get to the very fun job of breaking down that Tennessee scheme, which I love so much. We're breaking all that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. And don't forget that today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online, the number one source for all of your sports wagering needs, everything from your sports betting info, your sports betting news, analysis, stats, whatever it is that you're looking for. BetOnline.net has you covered all the way. You can get all the latest odds, you can get all the latest trends, lines, props, whatever it is that you're looking for, from professional to amateur leagues, including football, basketball, baseball, esports, soccer, whatever it is that you're looking for. They've got you taken care of. They've got it all over at BetOnline.net. And if you like sports podcasts, which you know you do, because here you are, you can go ahead and check out BetOnline's as well, so you can get up and stay up to date with everything that's going on across the trends in action in the betting world, making sure you have the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. And I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar as well, the best tasting protein bar on the market. Let me tell you about one of these right quick. Holidays are around. I don't know if you're like me, you like peppermint. I love peppermint. I don't really do like flavored lattes very often inside the coffee shop, but like peppermint mochas and all those stuff. I love me some peppermint, right? Peppermint hot chocolate, all that good stuff. Let me tell you what Built Bar has to offer. They have white chocolate peppermint granola. It's their take on a granola bar, but it's more filling and still insanely tasty without loading up on all the sugar and calories and all those other things. They've also got candy cane brownie, which sounds like an absolute dream. And that's in a Built Puff bar. So that's the marshmallowy goodness that comes with that. It's like the universe's most delicious cloud, if you will. So you can go ahead and try all that out, because if you haven't tried out Built Bar just yet, you're literally missing out on the best tasting protein bars ever built. 100% real chocolate, 17 grams of protein, shockingly low in terms of sugar, shockingly low in terms of calories, just 130 calories despite all of that deliciousness. So make sure you go and check them out. You can get 15% off of your order right now by using the promo code LOCKEDON15, Make sure you use the numerals at built.com. Once again, that's promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with our closing points on the idea of whether or not the New Orleans Saints should go after Hendon Hooker in this year's NFL draft. One of the biggest kind of critiques you're going to hear about Hendon Hooker over the course of the draft process is that he was only really successful in the sort of veer and shoot wide receiver option offense, and that getting him to adjust to an NFL offense might be a big time leap. And that is absolutely true. But let's face it, that's true for any NFL or any college quarterback coming into the NFL. They are going to have some type of a leap to a system or a scheme that they're going to have to make. But there is something specific about Hendon Hooker's system that I do think it's not that far-fetched to say that some of these principles could translate to the NFL along with him. So with that being the case, if the New Orleans Saints want to invest in Hendon Hooker, they absolutely cannot move forward with the current staff. There is going to be some change that has to happen on the offensive staff. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how to change all that. But first, let's talk about why you would have to make those changes. The first of which is that the system that is going on in Tennessee, the Josh Heupel offense, is kind of this veer and shoot variation, which is kind of a part of the Art Briles, Kendall Briles type of a system. And so with all of that, what you're looking at in that system is what's called receiver options. Now, you've heard this before. Pretty much one of the things that made Drew Brees and Michael Thomas so successful, so deadly, and really I'd throw Marcus Colston in here as well, were the options that those wide receivers were given. They were trusted with reading defenses and seeing the same thing that the quarterback was seeing, so that it wasn't kind of all on Drew Brees to read through, although he was one of the best in the NFL, if not the best in the NFL, when it came to reading the defense. You also had these receivers that were reading defensive leverage and things like that as well. So if a receiver was running, let's say, what's called a 10-yard stem, which just means a vertical push for 10 yards before you make your break. If a cornerback has outside leverage toward the sideline, then maybe you bend that route back in a little bit to the outside. If they're sitting on top, then maybe you come back down towards the quarterback. If you have an inside defender, if you're an inside receiver and that kind of overhang linebacker that you're trying to get up and over plays down, then maybe you cut inside and you post. There's a couple of different ways that sort of like those guys would have to see things developing on the field at the same time that Drew Brees saw the things developing on the field, and you had to see the same thing. That's what the sort of veer and shoot variation offense that Tennessee ran was, with Hendon Hooker at the helm. Hendon Hooker at the helm. That's fun to say. So if there's concerns about reading a defense, that's really all these guys did. They didn't predetermine anything pre-snap. They determined everything after the snap. And the quarterback and the receivers had to be seeing the same thing. So each set of wide receivers, depending upon where they were lined up, outside or inside, had a set of rules based upon defender leverage. If they're, sitting on top, then they would bend back down. If they were even, then they would just keep running and turn that into a vertical route. If they were on the outside, then they would bend back inside. So there were just like all these little different rules that every receiver has based on where their alignment was. And they did a lot of interesting things in terms of their alignment that are just not going to translate to the NFL game simply because of one thing. And it's really, really simple. And it's a funny thing because you never really think about it. But the hash marks in college are so much wider than the hash marks in the NFL. They're a little bit tighter toward the center of the field. So what does that mean? What would oftentimes happen is that depending upon where the ball was laterally at the snap, whether it be on the outside hash or right in the middle of the field, that determined how wide or where wide receivers lined up toward the outside. I'm getting really nerdy here, so just hang with me for a second. The simple fact of the matter is that the hash marks are tighter to the inside of the field, to the center of the field in the NFL. So one of the rules that Tennessee had was like, your outside most receiver, if the hash mark was on the right side or was on the right hash, would be all the way out in between the numbers and the sideline. So like less than 5 yards away from the sideline. That's really far away on an NFL field and much further away than it is on a college field. So there would be things that would have to inherently change, but you can still take some of these receiver options and translate them to the NFL game and play a little bit more of a deep option first offense in the NFL. Now, you have to have an offensive line that can hold up, and you have to have a good passer that can make every throw on the field, and you have to have smart receivers. Is that too out of the question for the New Orleans Saints? They would have to figure that part out. That's why the scheme change would have to be predicated by a regime change. I don't think you can have Pete Carmichael call that type of an offense, this kind of run and shoot, veer and shoot spread offense, when everything about his career so far has been predicated and built around Sean Payton's West Coast / Air Coryell blend of an offense. It's a unique offense as the New Orleans Saints have always run. This too would be a unique offense. And you don't have to change everything. You just kind of have to make a couple of adjustments and include some of the things that Hendon Hooker does well into your offense. Is that too much to ask? I don't think so, but I'm not a coordinator. I'm not a coach, right? So I might just be an idiot with a microphone. So the next piece is that if you did that, what are the changes that would have to happen? I'm going to give you 3 different examples here. You can tell me if you hate them. You can tell me if you love them. First of which is that if you do end up making a change at head coach, guys like Frank Reich, and of course a guy like Shane Steichen over Philadelphia, the offensive coordinator, they would be really, really good fits for Hendon Hooker as a style, but they would also be really good fits in terms of like teaching him how to rein in the rest of the game, how to progress over the field, make NFL reads, all of those things. So adding elements to his game while incorporating elements of what he already does to his game. Those guys being head coaches and play callers allows you to keep a little bit of continuity in other places on the field while also still making bigger changes. A guy like Ronald Curry moving into offensive coordinator / quarterbacks coach, still an option. Why would you keep Ronald Curry here? A, because he's great, but B, because he has experience not only as a quarterback, but also as a wide receiver. If you're going to run an offense that has receiver options, having a guy that can translate the wide receiver game to a quarterback with experience is not a bad idea at all. You could also keep a guy like Cody Burns and just move him up to pass game coordinator. The second option would be the same thing that we just said about head coach as well as offensive coordinator and quarterback coach. But then instead of keeping Cody Burns as pass game coordinator, you keep him as the wide receiver coach and then add a guy like Brian Hartline, potentially out of Ohio State. You'd have to compete with a potential offensive coordinator spot for him at that program, or a guy like Kendall Briles, who knows this system extremely well. If you're wondering where you've seen him before, think about the offense in Arkansas in college right now and how successful they've been. You add him as pass game coordinator and then get exactly what it is that Hendon Hooker's entire success has been based off of. Get that infused into your offense that way. The other way that you could go, and this feels like the most likely scenario if the Saints were to keep Dennis Allen. You keep Dennis Allen at head coach, but then you allow Ronald Curry to be the guy, offensive coordinator, play caller, and then you bring in Cody Burns as your pass game coordinator and add a new quarterback coach, which could be a guy like Kendall Briles, for instance, or vice versa. You add him as the pass game coordinator, and then you keep Cody Burns for another year at wide receiver coach. And all of those guys together should have enough on the offensive staff to be able to handle the play calling and to be able to input this system that would benefit and sort of highlight a guy like Hendon Hooker. If you're Dennis Allen in that case, you get the style quarterback that you almost broke the bank for this past offseason when you were going for Deshaun Watson, and you get to say, okay, this is my second year now. I'm going to try this out again with my quarterback, and you get to go and invest in that quarterback. It's a route. It's a way that the New Orleans Saints could go if they decide to keep Dennis Allen at head coach. Now, I know that there are some other things here. There is a really good quarterback class coming up at 2024. I personally don't think when you have no answer at quarterback right now, that it keeps you from reinvesting in quarterback again the next season if you end up in position to do that. If a guy like Hendon Hooker comes in and performs to, is able to be, start for you as a rookie, and you end up picking in the sort of range where you can get a Caleb Williams, I don't think you pass up on Caleb Williams and then you kind of do an old Arizona Cardinals. I don't think that one door closes another. And so if you make this investment here, it's not the end of the road. You're not married to anything. That is not the way that the NFL works. You swing to hit. You don't not swing because you're afraid to miss. So swing away, because this is the most important position on the field. And you might not have an answer at the time that the NFL draft rolls around. So you got to find one. And Hendon Hooker could be that guy. All right, family, that was a lot of fun for me. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. We got a little bit into the weeds there in the third part of the show, but I always do enjoy that. If you have any questions or if you have comments, thoughts, what would you do? Would you go after Hendon Hooker? Or are you waiting for somebody else? Now, remember, we've got an entire offseason, anywhere between 5 to 10 shows a week. So Hendon Hooker is not the only option in this year's draft. We're going to be breaking down draft prospects every single week moving forward on Thursdays with the two-a-days and then even beyond. So we've got so many more quarterbacks to talk about, so many more players to talk about in the NFL draft. And tomorrow, we're going to be taking a look at not only are we going to be breaking down more around the New Orleans Saints in present, in future, we're going to be taking a look at the free agents as well that the New Orleans Saints should be looking at. So is there a slew of free agent quarterbacks that they could be going after? And what's going to happen, most importantly, with Jameis Winston? We're going to break all of that down in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you as always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much, as always, for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. And as always, if you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.